States' massive retaliation strikes. It took a decade for the mad policy of mutually assured destruction to prevail. But throughout the 1960s, the U.S. and NATO deployed so-called tactical theater nuclear weapons, many with the destructive capability of the Hiroshima A-bomb, as well as strategic hydrogen nuclear weapons at sea, more powerful than up to 50 times more powerful than the Nagasaki A-bomb. By the mid-1960s, with more than 7,000 U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe, Europeans rightly feared that they would suffer the most in a nuclear war. It was widely understood that a so-called limited war could easily escalate to a total nuclear war. And as Daniel Ellsberg learned, the U.S. Single Integrated Operational Plan, which is to say launching all of the missiles, anticipated the deaths of more than 500 million people across Eurasia. This was U.S. and NATO doctrine, the murder of more than 500 million people. Then as now, the challenge for U.S. strategists was to prevent Europe's decoupling from the United States, the Western foothold on Eurasia. To prevent Europe from going its own way, the Nuclear Planning Group was created, as were dual-key launch controls. Throughout this period, the U.S. NATO nuclear arsenal had objectives other than containment. As President Carter's Secretary of War, Harold Brown, testified, with nuclear weapons as the core of U.S. security systems, U.S. conventional forces became, and I quote, meaningful instruments of military and political power. As Noam Chomsky explained, this meant that we have succeeded in sufficiently intimidating anyone who might help protect those we are determined to attack. Thus, as early as 1946, before the Soviet Union broke the U.S. nuclear monopoly, President Truman threatened Moscow with nuclear annihilation in order to reinforce U.S. dominance in Iran. U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe were essential to U.S. preparations for and threats to initiate nuclear war, not only during the Berlin crises of 1948 and 1961, but as the U.S. reinforced its hegemony of the oil-rich Middle East, which was long the geostrategic center of the struggle for world power. As I've outlined in my book, which is outside Empire and the Bomb, such threats were also made during the Suez Crisis in 1956, the incursion into Lebanon and the revolution in Iraq in 1958, the 1962 missile crisis, in which the U.S. threatened all of human existence in order to enforce the principle that the U.S. could deploy nuclear weapons along the Soviet Union's periphery, especially Turkey, but that the Soviet Union could not do likewise. We made these threats and preparations during the Six-Day Middle East War in 1967, the Iraq Wars of 1991 and 2003, and the current all options are on the table threats against Iran. Please understand, Nagasaki was not the last time that the U.S. used nuclear weapons. It's used those weapons repeatedly, just as an armed robber uses a gun when he points it at someone's head. Whether or not the trigger is pulled